Winslet is here, y'all. That was a look at her new film, Lee, about the remarkable life of the photojournalist Lee Miller. So we're gonna get into the movie, ma'am. But for those who don't know, tell everybody who Lee Miller was.
So Lee Miller was a war correspondent, and she went to war during World War II. She was an American woman, but she was living in England at the time during the Blitz with her then lover, Roland Penrose, played by Alexander Skarsgård in our movie. She was not some up-and-coming young photographer trying to make a name for herself. She was a flawed, middle-aged woman who was determined to seek justice, and she just refused to hide behind the truth of the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Now, women were not being given permission to go to the front line. So she was one of about 4 or 5 women globally who was given permission to go into Europe. And even when she got there, she was hit with more red tape, and she was told no women in the press briefing, etc. But she just kept going because she knew that it was right to bear witness, and to be that visual voice for victims of conflict. But what she was doing that was so extraordinary was that she was not doing what a lot of male photographers were doing, which was to photograph the soldiers and the bloodshed and the gunfire. I always say to people, this isn't a war film, it's a film about a woman who looked behind the curtain and into the cracks and saw the suffering of the children and the women, or the collaborators having their heads shaved in the village square and shamed in front of all the people. And most importantly, Lee was one of the very first photographers through the gates of Dachau on the day of the liberation. And she was there to witness and document the atrocities that lay within those gates. She was extraordinary.
I'll tell you what, I learned something about myself. I was telling you in the break, I was about to tell you something, and I started watching it, and I was very bothered at first, because I think because we only know from our own perspective, our own lives, right? Our own lens, right? And I learned something about myself because I was watching it, and I was like, I don't know that I like someone taking photos of these things. Like, are they capitalizing on it and getting their photos? At first, I was like bothered by it. And then by the end of it, I was like, oh, wow, what a judgmental thing I just did. Like, I just looked from my own lens and my perspective, not thinking the intention of this person, not knowing the motivation, not anything. And then knowing that these pictures represented people that would have been forgotten. Nobody would have even known
that's
of
exactly,
them because of these pictures. So these pictures, it taught me, like, which I don't feel films do that. No offense to films now, but I just mean there's not a lot of films that I walk away literally learning something about my actual character and going, wow. So I was quick to judge that individual without realizing she was trying to tell someone's story that was never going to be told, and no one would print, and no one wanted to bother with it because it was ugly, and it was like not the good side of humanity. They wanted to focus on the party, and it's going to be over, and the war, and what, and it just really let me in on even. I feel like in our generation, photojournalism is just different.
Well, it is different now. And Lee was at the very beginning of what we now know to be such important reportage photography. You know, it's hard to hear and see the truth sometimes.
Boy.
But Lee had experienced a trauma as a child, which she refused to allow to define her. But what it did give her was it gave her an ability to see the world in a completely singular way and to spot evil from a mile off. However, she was a phenomenal life liver. She took risks. She was proud of her physical self. She actually really adored men. She wasn't vengeful. She was utterly without malice, and she did not judge people. And I think that her skill with her camera, she used something called a Rolleiflex camera, and a Rolleiflex camera actually hangs around the neck and it sits almost just below the heart. And you look down into the image, and it's a very, very wide lens. So what that meant was that Lee was able to frame her image up and then meet the gaze of the person she was photographing, to see into them, to see who they were.
Oh, like the little girl.
Yes, to tell their story in their way, to actually be present with them, to show up, not look away, not retreat, not go home and say, actually, this is too much for me, but to stay present. And you're exactly right, Kelly, that if she was able to take those photographs with her female eye, she knew that she was going to be able to preserve and protect and uphold the stories of those victims that may never otherwise have been told in that way, with empathy and respect and resilience and grace. And that's who Lee Miller was.
Absolutely. And also, like, there's a scene in the movie where I want to touch on this because you said with a female eye. I think there's a very important part, which is so sad, but you have to reveal that you're a woman because you don't want to scare the people, because unfortunately things happen. So it's, you know, it is a powerful thing to tell it from that perspective, because people, for, you know, many reasons, get more comfortable around, especially a little girl in this situation in the movie. Like, she was more comfortable, I think, seeing that you are a woman. She shouldn't fear you, but which I thought was so well done.
And also, Lee had been in danger of being sort of pigeonholed by history through the male gaze. So in her 20s, she did some modelling, and she was the lover and muse of an important surrealist artist named Man Ray. And if I Googled Lee Miller when I first started preparing for this film and researching it in 2015, which is how long this journey has been for me, it would say, former muse, ex-lover of Man Ray, ex-cover girl, former Vogue model. Lee hated being a model. She did it for a snippet of her life, and actually, she was the old-fashioned version of cancelled because she did an advertisement for sanitary napkins, which was apparently not the done thing, so she could never get another job anyway. She didn't care, she wanted to be a photographer.
Yeah.
So she just carried on with her life, and it was this decade of her life that we cover in the film when, for me, Lee really became Lee. And I had to think hard about what decade of her life would she have been the proudest of, and I absolutely believe, and actually know, it would have been this one, because I spent so much time with her son, Anthony Penrose, who's in his 70s now. He's been a hugely important person in this process for me.
And to have all those photos, those journals, those diaries.
We had full access to the archive, so all of her 60,000 negatives and prints that, ladies and gentlemen, he did not discover until after her death in 1977. She never spoke of what she'd done during the war. Like so many people who had acute PTSD, she just put it into boxes and just put it away. Didn't want to think about it anymore.
See, and that's another layer, like with the film. It's another layer. Even the parental relationship, you know, understanding your parents and understanding PTSD, there's so many different layers to the film, so many different messages. It's such an important, that's why I said in the call, I wrote you a card, I was like, thank you for making it. Like, I don't know if people say thank you enough, like, for making films that really, I think, can progress society and progress our thinking and progress a better version of ourselves out of us, right?
Well, people don't really know who Lee Miller was.
I didn't.
And so, well, we made this film for you and for people who have never heard of her or who have heard of her for being a model before. And I wanted to redefine how we view this wonderful woman and how we appreciate and open up our ears and our eyes to women of historical significance who did extraordinary things without whom, who knows, women may never have had their rightful place at that table alongside the men. And Lee knew that not only did she have a right to be at that table, but she had the right to be sitting right at the head of it. And I think that that's a great example of how this is living life.
It's remarkable. And it kind of goes to show, too, thinking about looking at our peers and who we are around, you know, we have many layers. We're more than just this one thing, you know? And I think that that's important too. What did you learn about yourself while making it? Because you made so many films. You do pick some tragic characters sometimes. And I'm like, do you take that home ever?
Yeah. You take it home. People always say to me, so how do you, cool off at the end of a day? Do you have a glass of wine and a bath? I'm like, no, I come home and I do everything I can as quickly as possible so that I can prepare for the next day. And on this, actually, with Lee, because I was a producer as well, and in an extremely hands-on way, having sort of developed it by myself really for the first 4 or 5 years. My producing partner, Kate Solomon, came on sort of halfway through that process, and we lived together when we were shooting. We just absolutely had to, because there was always so much to do in the evening, whether it was financial questions that needed to be answered or figuring out if we really could afford that location that we'd held on Friday. Actually, oh, no, we can't, so we're going to have to shoot it somewhere else, and no, we can't have those cars.
And then weather changes everything.
And weather changes everything. And so we do, but, I actually think I thrive in a kind of charged, immersive experience, like this one really was. And you're right, I do pick tricky characters, but but sometimes I think, life's too short.
Well, and those are the interesting ones too.
Yeah, they are. They are the interesting ones.
Yeah.
I completely agree.